And to help us wrap our heads around all this, we're going to be looking at excerpts from, you ready for this? Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason.
Whoa, Kant, that's intense.
It is. It's a super important book in philosophy, and it really digs into these questions about reality, knowledge, and what our minds can and can't do. So to kick things off, Kant talks about this moment, like a turning point in science, when this light kind of dawned on some really important thinkers. Guys like Bacon, Galileo, those guys.
The scientific revolution.
Yeah, exactly. But what was it about their approach that was so different, so groundbreaking, according to Kant?
Well, what he points out is that these scientists weren't just sitting around passively watching nature, They were actively engaging with it, using their reason to guide their observations. They'd come up with these principles, these ideas about how things worked, and then they'd test them out, kind of like interrogating nature with experiments.
So it wasn't just about seeing what was happening. It was about having a framework, a way of thinking, and then using that to try and understand the world around them.
Exactly. Like they had this hunch, and they'd say, okay, nature, is this how you work? Let's find out.
So that's where the rationalism comes in. They were using their reason, their logic, to shape how they looked at things.
Exactly. And for Kant, this was huge. He was basically saying that reason isn't just this empty vessel waiting to be filled with experiences. It's got its own structure, its own way of processing information.
Okay, I'm starting to see where this is going. So now let's talk about Kant's book itself, The Critique of Pure Reason. Just the title, critique, kind of makes it sound like he's trying to tear down reason, doesn't it?
It does sound that way, but that's not quite it. Really what he's doing is setting limits. He's saying, look, reason is powerful, but it's got to stay in its lane.
So like boundaries for reason?
Yeah, exactly. It's like you can't just speculate endlessly about things you can't possibly experience or prove. You got to ground your thinking in something real.
Okay, so setting some rules of the game for how we use our reason. But it wasn't just about limits, right? There was a positive side to this critique too.
Oh, absolutely. By setting these limits, he was actually trying to protect something really important, what he called the moral use of pure reason. Our sense of right and wrong, our ethics.
So by saying reason has its limits when it comes to speculating about, the ultimate nature of reality, he's creating space for our morals to operate without being undermined by pure logic.
Exactly. He's saying, hey, there are some things reason can't fully grasp, and that's okay. It's like acknowledging the mystery.
That's a pretty profound idea, actually. Now let's get to one of Kant's, most famous ideas, the difference between phenomena and things in themselves. This seems pretty crucial to his whole philosophy.
It really is. So phenomena, that's basically the world as we experience it. The stuff we see, hear, touch, smell, all of that.
Okay, so the world we interact with every day, what we perceive with our senses. Got it. What about things in themselves? What are those?
Well, that's the tricky part. Things in themselves, which he also calls noumena, are how things exist independently of us, independent of our perception. And here's the kicker. Kant says we can never truly know things in themselves. We can only ever know how they appear to us.
Whoa, hold on. So you're saying there's this whole other level of reality out there that we can't even access?
That's exactly what he's saying. Imagine there's this, ultimate reality behind the curtain, but we can only ever see the shadows it casts on the wall.
Okay, that's a pretty wild thought, but why did he think this distinction was so important?
Well, one of his key arguments is that our experience is always structured by space and time. We can't perceive anything outside of those frameworks. But are space and time actually properties of things in themselves? Or are they just built-in features of our minds, the way we process information?
So, our brains are already wired to see the world in terms of space and time, regardless of whether those things are actually fundamental to reality itself?
Exactly. Kant calls space and time forms of our sensible intuition. They're like the lenses through which we experience everything.
Okay, I think I'm following. So, if space and time are kind of like our mental filters, then our knowledge is limited to this phenomenal world, this filtered reality. But didn't you say earlier that we can still think about things in themselves?
Yeah, that's the interesting part. We can't have direct, scientific knowledge of them, but we can still think about the concept. After all, it seems kind of weird to say an appearance exists without something that's appearing, right?
Yeah, that does seem odd. You can't have a reflection without something being reflected. So there's got to be something there, even if we can't fully grasp it.
Exactly. Now, all this has some pretty big implications for metaphysics, which is basically the study of ultimate reality.
Right, that whole trying to figure out what it's all about thing. So how did Kant view traditional metaphysics with its questions about God, freedom, and immortality?
He thought a lot of it was too, how do I put this, dogmatic. Like people were trying to answer these massive questions without really examining whether reason was even capable of doing that.
So it's like trying to solve a complex math problem without understanding the basic rules of math first.
Exactly. Got to check your tools before you start building, right?
Makes sense. So to understand how we actually gain knowledge, Kant made this distinction between analytical and synthetical judgments. Can you break that down for us?
Sure. So an analytical judgment is basically one where the predicate, the thing you're saying about the subject, is already contained in the concept of the subject itself.
Okay, can you give an example?
Like, all bachelors are unmarried men. The idea of being unmarried is already baked into the definition of a bachelor.
Right, it's like stating the obvious. So what about synthetical judgments?
Those are judgments where the predicate adds something new to the subject, something that wasn't already there in the definition.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get it. So analytical judgments are kind of like tautologies, true by definition, while synthetical judgments actually give us new information about the world.
Exactly. And Kant said that the real progress in knowledge, the really interesting stuff, comes from these synthetical judgments. But then he throws in another wrinkle, the difference between a priori and a posteriori knowledge.
Hold on, more jargon. All right, lay it on me. What's the difference?
So a priori knowledge is knowledge that we have independently of any particular experience, like 2 + 2 = 4. You don't need to go out and count apples to know that's true. It's just true by definition.
Okay, so a priori is like, I know this just by thinking about it. What about a posteriori?
That's knowledge we get from experience, like the sky is blue. You got to actually look up and see it to know that.
Got it. So analytical judgments seem like they're usually a priori, and synthetical judgments seem like they're a posteriori. But then Kant throws in this whole other category, synthetical a priori judgments. What the heck are those?
That's where things get really interesting. These are judgments that give us new information about the world, like synthetical judgments, but we know them with a kind of certainty that doesn't come from experience, like a priori judgments.
Okay, wait. How can you know something new about the world without actually experiencing it? That sounds kind of impossible.
That's the puzzle Kant was wrestling with. And to solve it, he came up with this idea of transcendental logic.
Okay, here we go again. More big words.
I know, but it's actually not that complicated. Basically, transcendental logic is the study of how our minds structure our experience so that we can have knowledge about objects before we fully experience them.
So it's like our minds come preloaded with certain ways of understanding the world.
Exactly. And one of the key ways our minds do this is through what Kant calls pure conceptions of the understanding, or categories.
Categories, like folders in our brains.
Kind of. They're like the basic building blocks of thought, the fundamental concepts we use to organize all the sensory data we're bombarded with.
Okay, give me some examples.
Sure. Some of the categories include things like unity, plurality, totality, reality, negation, substance and accident, cause and effect, all these really basic ways we think about the world.
So these categories are kind of like the grammar of our experience. They help us make sense of the jumble of sensations we're constantly receiving.
That's a great way to put it. It's like our minds are taking all these raw ingredients from our senses and using the categories to bake them into a coherent cake.
Cake. All right, so we have these categories, these mental structures. But how do they connect to the actual world, the things in themselves? How do they gain what Kant calls objective reality?
Well, he says they gain objective reality by being applied to phenomena. Remember, everything we experience is filtered through space and time, the forms of our sensibility, and then it's further organized by the categories, the forms of our understanding. So anything we can possibly experience has to conform to these structures.
So it's not that the categories are like inherent properties of things in themselves. It's that they're the necessary condition for us to experience anything at all.
Exactly, and because of that, we can be sure that these categories are objectively real, at least within the realm of our experience. Now, there's this other concept Kant brings up that's kind of important, the transcendental deduction.
Okay, I'm sensing another headache coming on.
I promise it's not that bad. Think about it like this. The transcendental deduction is Kant's way of justifying why we can use these categories, these mental structures, to understand the world.
So, like, proving that our mental tools are actually the right ones for the job.
Exactly. It's like, hey, we're using these categories to make sense of things, but do we have the right to do that? Are they really valid? And the transcendental deduction is his argument for why they are.
Gotcha. So it's like the philosophical groundwork for why we can trust our own minds.
Precisely. Now, Kant also talks about these supreme principles that govern different types of judgments.
Okay, hit me with those.
For analytical judgments, the supreme principle is super simple. It's the principle of non-contradiction. Basically, an analytical judgment is true as long as it doesn't contradict itself.
Okay, that makes sense. What about synthetical judgments?
For those, the supreme principle is a bit more complex. It's the idea that the possibility of experience itself gives objective reality to our a priori cognitions.
Hold on, slow down. What does that even mean?
It means that for a synthetical a priori judgment to be true, it has to relate to the fundamental conditions that make experience possible in the first place.
So even though these judgments are a priori, meaning we don't need experience to know them, they still have to be connected to the framework of our experience somehow.
Exactly. They can't just be random, arbitrary thoughts. They have to be grounded in the possibility of experience itself.
Okay, I think I'm starting to see the connections here. Now let's move on to something Kant calls the anticipations of perception. Specifically, this idea of intensive quantity.
Right. So this principle is basically saying that in every perception we have, the real element, the thing that's actually being sensed, has a certain degree or intensity.
Can you give an example?
Like, imagine you're feeling something warm. There's a range from no warmth at all to, like, burning hot, right? There's a measurable intensity to that sensation.
Right, it's not just a binary warm or not warm. There's a whole spectrum.
Exactly. And Kant is saying that this kind of continuous measurable quality is fundamental to how we experience reality. It's something our understanding anticipates, hence the term anticipations of perception.
I like that. It's like our minds are already prepared for the world to have this kind of structure.
Exactly. And then we have the analogies of experience, which introduce some even more fundamental principles. Things like the permanence of substance, causality, and community.
Okay, break those down for me.
The permanence of substance basically says that there's some underlying stuff that persists through all the changes we observe in the world. Like a tree might grow, lose its leaves, change shape, but it's still fundamentally a tree. There's some enduring substance there.
So even though things are constantly changing, there's some kind of stable foundation underneath it all.
Exactly. And then there's causality, which is the idea that every event has a cause. We don't just perceive a random sequence of happenings. We understand them as events that are connected, that have a reason for occurring.
Cause and effect, that seems pretty intuitive.
It is. And then there's community or reciprocity, which is the idea that all the substances in the world are interconnected, that they influence each other.
So nothing exists in isolation.
Right. Everything is part of this web of interactions.
Okay, these all seem like really basic, fundamental ways we understand how the world works. But Kant was also very clear that there are limits to our understanding and reason. Right?
Oh, absolutely. He was very careful to point out that these categories and principles only apply to the world we can experience, the phenomenal world. We can't just go applying them willy-nilly to things beyond our possible experience.
Like we can't use them to prove or disprove the existence of God, for example.
Exactly. That kind of Chang is beyond the reach of our understanding, according to Kant. He says that those kinds of concepts belong to the realm of reason, which operates differently from the understanding.
Okay, so what's the deal with reason then? How is it different?
Well, reason is kind of like the understanding's older, more ambitious brother. It's always striving for complete, absolute knowledge, for ultimate explanations. And that leads to what Kant calls transcendental ideas.
All right, lay those on me. What are transcendental ideas?
They're basically these grand, overarching concepts that our reason comes up with in its quest for ultimate understanding. Things like the idea of a first cause, the idea of a soul, the idea of the universe as a whole. You know, the really big questions.
So these are ideas that go beyond what we can actually experience.
Exactly. We can't point to a first cause in the world or directly observe the soul or grasp the totality of the universe, but our reason still generates these ideas.
So what's the point of them then if they don't really tell us anything concrete about reality?
Well, Kant says they have a regulative function. They guide our understanding. They push us to keep searching for deeper explanations and connections, even if we know we'll never reach an ultimate answer.
So they're kind of like guiding principles, even though they don't directly correspond to anything we can experience.
Exactly. They keep us intellectually honest. You know, they remind us that there's always more to learn, more to explore.
I like that. It's like a constant reminder that we don't have all the answers.
Exactly. And finally, Kant talks about the difference between mathematical and philosophical cognition.
Okay, hit me with that one.
Well, he says the main difference is in their method. Mathematics deals with the general by constructing it in the particular. Like, you can draw a triangle, and from that, figure out all sorts of universal truths about triangles.
So it's like using a specific example to understand a general concept.
Exactly. Philosophy, on the other hand, deals with the particular only in the general. It tries to understand specific things by applying general concepts to them.
So it's more about applying pre-existing frameworks to understand specific instances.
Precisely. And that difference in method explains why math can have such precise definitions, while philosophy is more about interpreting and debating concepts.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground here. What are the key takeaways you'd want our listeners to walk away with?
I think the biggest thing is that our minds aren't just passively receiving information from the world, they're actively shaping our experience through these a priori structures like space and time and the categories.
So we're not just mirrors reflecting reality, we're actively constructing our understanding of it.
Exactly. And our knowledge is primarily limited to the phenomenal world, the world as it appears to us. We can think about things in themselves, but we can't really know them in any definitive way.
And while our reason pushes us towards these grand, ultimate explanations, these transcendental ideas, they're more like guiding principles than sources of concrete knowledge.
Right. They keep us searching, keep us questioning, but they don't provide us with any final answers.
So maybe those aha moments we're always searching for come not just from learning new facts, but also from understanding the limits of our own minds.
Exactly. Recognizing what we can't know is just as important as recognizing what we can know.
That's a great point. And here's a final thought for our listeners to ponder. How might Kant's ideas about the active role of the mind influence how you approach new information and different perspectives? Does it make you question the objectivity of your own understanding? Something to think about. And with that, we wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us.